A young family's trip to the majestic redwood forests took a tragic turn when they vanished without a trace. A massive search found no clues, and the case went cold for 4 years, becoming a local legend. That is, until a team of mycology students documented a strange growth at the base of a tree, a discovery that would expose a horrifying truth hidden just beneath the surface. The calls to Serena Quaid's cell phone began not with panic, but with mild frustration. It was late August 2013, and Odelia Hastings expected her daughter to have checked in hours ago. Serena, 32, her husband, Kalen Van Toft, 33, and their 6-month-old daughter, Isla, were due back from a 3-day trip exploring the towering groves of the Redwood National and State Parks in Northern California. They were seasoned travelers, Kalen especially, and their itinerary was supposed to be relaxed, with easy trails suitable for a baby carrier. Yet as the evening wore on, the scheduled call never came. Odelia tried Serena's phone again. It went straight to voicemail. She tried Kalen's. The same result. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in Odelia's chest. This was unlike them. Even in areas with poor reception, they always found a way to send a text or make a quick call, prioritizing communication precisely because their baby was with them. The silence from the remote northern coast felt heavy and unnatural. By the next morning, frustration had fully turned to fear. Odelia Hastings contacted the local police department, explaining that her daughter and son-in-law were significantly overdue and unreachable. The report was taken, and the information was relayed to the authorities with jurisdiction over the vast redwood parks. Investigators began the preliminary steps of tracing the family's movements. They learned that Kalen and Serena were a vibrant, active couple. Kalen, an environmental consultant, had a deep knowledge of wilderness safety and navigation. Serena, a graphic designer, was more cautious by nature, especially since Isla's birth, but she trusted Kalen's expertise completely. Their trip was meant to introduce Isla to the ancient forests. The itinerary they left behind was casual, focusing on the most accessible scenic routes and well-maintained trails. They had not packed a satellite phone, assuming it was unnecessary for such casual hikes. The first concrete piece of information came from the digital world. Recognizing that the couple likely took photos, investigators requested access to their cloud storage accounts. In 2013, automatic uploads depended entirely on finding a signal. As investigators combed through recent activity, they found something. A single photograph had synced 2 days prior, time-stamped around midday. The image instantly became the centerpiece of the investigation. It showed Kalen, Serena, and Isla standing on a wide dirt trail, dwarfed by the immense trunks of the redwoods. The lighting was soft, filtered by the dense canopy. Kalen, with his shaved head and light beard, was smiling broadly. He wore a muted green t-shirt and beige shorts, with the straps of a backpack visible. Strapped to his chest in a dark gray carrier was Isla, her face turned toward the camera, adorned with a distinctive pink headband featuring a small bow. To his right stood Serena, her long dark hair framing a warm smile. She was dressed in a vibrant blue t-shirt and dark blue leggings, a matching fanny pack slung around her waist. Her arm was wrapped around Kalen's back, her other hand resting protectively on the baby carrier. It was a picture of idyllic happiness, but in the context of their disappearance, it felt haunting. Metadata embedded in the file confirmed the location, near a popular scenic route within the park system. Analyzing the angle and framing of the shot, investigators concluded that the photo was not a selfie. The perspective suggested the phone had been handed to a third party, another hiker who happened upon them. This realization presented 2 immediate tasks: locate the physical starting point of their hike and identify the person who took the picture. The first task was straightforward. Utilizing the location data, park rangers quickly located the trailhead corresponding to the photo. There, parked neatly in the designated area, was the family's vehicle. It was locked, undisturbed, and showed no signs of forced entry or a struggle. The presence of the car suggested they had embarked on their hike as planned and intended to return, but they never did. The Van Quaid family had seemingly stepped onto that trail and vanished into the ancient forest. The discovery of the vehicle mobilized a massive response. The Redwood National and State Parks are not just a collection of trees. They are a sprawling, complex ecosystem covering over 139,000 acres. The terrain is characterized by steep ravines, dense undergrowth, and trees so massive they create a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. 4 search and rescue teams, It is one of the most challenging environments in North America. The initial strategy was saturation. Dozens of professional searchers, K-9 units, and volunteers were deployed, starting from the trailhead and fanning outwards. The difficulty of the operation became immediately apparent. The dense canopy, hundreds of feet high, made aerial searches by helicopter nearly useless, obscuring any view of the ground. On the ground, visibility was often limited to just a few feet. The forest floor, carpeted with centuries of fallen needles and debris, made tracking footprints incredibly difficult, even for experienced trackers. Odelia Hastings arrived at the hastily established command center near the trailhead. The agonizing uncertainty was etched on her face. She, along with Kalen's family, provided investigators with critical details about the couple's gear, hiking habits, and personalities. Odelia was adamant that Kalen, despite his adventurous spirit, was meticulous about safety. He would never, she insisted, take reckless risks with Serena, and especially not with 6-month-old Isla. She described the specific brand of the baby carrier, the color of the blanket they always kept with Isla, and the contents of the backpack Kalen was likely carrying: standard day hike supplies, water, snacks, and a basic first aid kit, but nothing intended for overnight survival. The search continued for days, then weeks. Teams meticulously covered the main trail where the photo was taken, pushing miles in every direction. They also began the arduous process of searching off-trail areas, battling thickets of huckleberry and massive ferns. The scale of the environment was overwhelming. It was entirely possible for a person to be just 50 feet off the trail and remain completely invisible. Despite the exhaustive efforts, the search yielded nothing. No dropped water bottle, no fibers from clothing caught on a branch, no sign of a struggle, no discarded diaper. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed them whole. Investigators turned their attention back to the only witness they knew existed: the photographer. The hope was that this individual might remember which direction the family headed, or perhaps recall something unusual about their demeanor. Identifying a random hiker in a popular tourist destination was a formidable task. Investigators circulated the image, hoping the person might recognize themselves, or that someone else might identify the family and recall seeing the interaction. Weeks into the investigation, the breakthrough came. The individual was identified as a tourist from Germany who had already returned. Through international cooperation, authorities contacted him. The man vividly recalled the encounter. He remembered the happy couple and the baby with the pink headband. He confirmed they had briefly chatted about the beauty of the grove. He offered to take the photo, and then they parted ways. Crucially, he stated that the family continued down the main established trail. He saw nothing suspicious, no one following them, nothing out of the ordinary. The lead, which had seemed so promising, evaporated into mundane reality. As the physical search stalled, investigators began exploring other possibilities. The wilderness holds more dangers than just the elements. A month into the search, a specialized tracking team operating deep in an off-limits protected section of the park detected signs of recent disturbance. It wasn't related to the missing family, but it was significant. They found evidence of illegal old-growth poaching, a lucrative black market trade involving the cutting and theft of ancient redwood burls. This discovery introduced a new, sinister theory. The area where the poaching activity was detected was remote, but theoretically accessible from where the family vanished. Investigators considered the possibility that Kalen and Serena had inadvertently ventured off-trail and stumbled upon an illegal operation in progress. Timber poachers were known to be territorial and potentially dangerous. Could the family have been silenced to protect the criminal enterprise? For several weeks, this theory gained traction. It provided a plausible explanation for the complete absence of evidence, a deliberate effort to conceal a crime. Detectives began investigating local timber black markets, looking for informants and recent movements of high-value wood. They interviewed known associates of poaching rings in the region. However, the investigation found no correlation. The timing didn't align perfectly, and informants within the poaching community, when pressed, offered nothing connecting their activities to the family's disappearance. The theory, like the physical search, hit a dead end. After 2 months, the relentless pace of the search operation became unsustainable. The weather began to turn, and the resources required were immense. With no new leads and the probability of survival diminishing, the active search was officially scaled back. The case remained open, intensely scrutinized by Odelia Hastings, but the initial urgency faded. The disappearance of the Van Craft-Toffquade family became another tragic mystery held by the silent, ancient woods. The trail had gone completely cold. The narrative jumps forward 4 years to the summer of 2017. The memory of the missing family had begun to fade from public consciousness. Though Odelia Hastings continued to press authorities for answers, the forest, meanwhile, continued its slow, inexorable cycle of growth and decay. That summer, a small group of graduate students specializing in mycology from a university in Oregon was conducting intensive field research within the Redwood National and State Parks. They were led by Xander Zeller, a meticulous researcher focused on how recent wildfires were affecting fungal growth. Their research permits gave them access to remote, rarely visited sections of the park, miles away from the popular trails and nowhere near where Kaylin, Serena, and Isla had vanished. Their presence deep in this rugged terrain was legitimate, driven by scientific curiosity. The group had been hiking for hours, navigating steep slopes and dense undergrowth, moving between their established research grids. The air was damp and cool beneath the canopy, the only sound the crunch of their own movements. By early afternoon, they took a break near a large, ancient oak tree in a small clearing. Oak trees were uncommon here, making it a valuable landmark for their research. As they settled down, dropping their heavy packs and grabbing their lunches, Xander noticed something unusual at the base of the oak. His eyes, trained to spot subtle variations on the forest floor, were drawn to a bizarre, amorphous mass nestled against the tree's roots. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The growth was large, maybe 3 feet across, and shockingly colored. It was a chaotic mix of bright sulfur yellow and stark white with patches of deep oily black, as if dirt or decaying matter had been absorbed into its structure. The texture was lumpy, porous, and wet-looking, more like spilled chemical foam than a natural fungus. It looked completely alien against the dark, damp earth and the tree's reddish-brown bark. Curiosity piqued, Xander stood and approached the mass. As he got closer, the visual strangeness was matched by a distinct, unsettling odor. The forest usually smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and the sweet scent of decay. But this was different. It was a sharp, pungent, and deeply putrid stench that cut through the forest air, the unmistakable smell of advanced decomposition, amplified and concentrated. Xander called the other students over. They were equally fascinated and repulsed, spending several minutes examining the growth and discussing its potential origins. Was it a massive slime mold? A reaction to some environmental toxin? They took numerous high-resolution photos, documenting the strange coloration and texture from every angle. After thoroughly documenting the anomaly, the group shouldered their packs and continued to their next research grid, the strange encounter lingering in their minds. That evening, back at a remote research outpost, the group was reviewing their findings. They showed the photographs to a resident park botanist. He was stunned by the images, remarking on the sheer size and the unnatural, vibrant colors. Based on the visual evidence and Xander's description of the intense odor, the botanist offered a hypothesis. The growth was likely the result of decomposition gases from a large buried animal, perhaps a bear or an elk, fueling an extreme, localized fungal bloom. The nutrients released during decomposition, combined with specific environmental conditions, could create such an anomaly. This explanation resonated with the group. If a large animal carcass was indeed buried there, the decomposition process and its impact on the surrounding fungal ecology presented a unique research opportunity. It was a chance to document a rarely observed phenomenon. Driven by this scientific curiosity, Zeller and his team decided to return to the site the next day. They brought sampling tools, core samplers, and the compact survival shovels they carried for fieldwork. The hike back to the oak tree was swift and focused. When they arrived, the fungal mass was unchanged, the pungent odor still hanging heavily in the air. They began their work methodically. The plan was to take soil samples from around the mass, then carefully excavate a small section to determine the source of the nutrients. Zeller started digging at the edge of the growth. The soil was loose, making the initial digging easy. As he dug deeper, the stench intensified rapidly, becoming almost overwhelming. They had to take turns digging, the odor forcing them to step back for fresh air. A few feet down, Xander's shovel struck something resilient. It wasn't the resistance of a root or a rock, but something that gave way slightly under pressure. He cleared the loose dirt away. It was a sheet of heavy-duty black plastic. It wasn't a natural part of the forest floor. The realization that this wasn't a buried animal hit the group instantly. The atmosphere shifted from scientific curiosity to apprehension. They continued digging with a new sense of urgency, uncovering more of the plastic. It was a large tarp, layered multiple times, suggesting a deliberate effort to seal whatever was inside. The implications were ominous. This was a clandestine burial. Working together, they cleared enough dirt to expose a significant section of the tarp. Using a field knife, Xander carefully cut through the layers of plastic. The moment the seal was broken, the concentrated odor of decomposition rushed out. Peering into the opening, they saw not the fur of an animal, but the heavily decomposed remains of a human adult. The discovery was jarring. The students immediately stopped the excavation. The reality of their situation, deep in the wilderness, standing over a hidden grave, was overwhelming. Xander retrieved the satellite phone from his pack and, with shaking hands, contacted the authorities, reporting the discovery of human remains in one of the most remote sections of the park. The coordinates he provided directed authorities to a location far from any established trail system. The logistical challenge of reaching the site was significant. A specialized forensic team had to be airlifted as close as possible and then hike for several hours through the rugged terrain, carrying heavy equipment. The isolation that had kept the grave hidden for years now complicated the investigation. When the team arrived, they found the scene exactly as the students had described it, the bizarre, vibrant fungal growth contrasting sharply with the disturbed earth and the exposed section of black tarp. The students, who had remained nearby as instructed, were interviewed by the initial responding officers. They recounted the discovery, emphasizing the scientific curiosity that led them to dig and the shock of finding human remains. The forensic team began the meticulous process of securing the scene. The remote location required them to establish a perimeter and work under field conditions, battling the damp environment and the overwhelming odor emanating from the grave. The excavation was slow and methodical. Every layer of soil was sifted, every piece of potential evidence catalogued. The strange fungal growth was carefully documented and sampled, recognized as a byproduct of the decomposition process occurring beneath it. The excavation revealed the full extent of the burial. The body was tightly wrapped in multiple layers of heavy-duty black tarp, sealed with a thoroughness that suggested time and deliberation. This was not a hasty burial, it was a calculated disposal. After several hours of painstaking work, the body, still encased in the tarp, was removed from the grave and prepared for transport to the medical examiner's office. The initial assessment confirmed the remains were those of an adult male, but the identity remained unknown. The news of the discovery rippled through the region, reaching Odelia Hastings. The discovery of a body in the redwoods inevitably raised the painful possibility that it might be connected to the disappearance of her family 4 years earlier. The uncertainty was agonizing. At the medical examiner's office, the process of identification began. The advanced state of decomposition made visual identification impossible. The remains were largely skeletonized, with some preserved tissue remaining within the anaerobic environment created by the tarp. Dental records were requested for all long-term missing persons associated with the area, including Kalen Van Craftoft. The comparison yielded a definitive match. The remains were confirmed to be those of Kalen Van Craftoft. For years after he vanished, Kalen had been found. The discovery was a devastating blow to his family and to Odelia Hastings. It confirmed their worst fears, but also shattered the previous theories about the family getting lost or falling victim to the elements. Kalen had been deliberately buried, hidden deep in the wilderness. This strongly suggested foul play was involved, at least in the disposal of his body. But the discovery raised a terrifying new question. Where were Serena and Isla? The grave contained only Kalen's remains. There was no sign of his wife or their baby daughter. The mystery deepened, taking a darker turn. The autopsy commenced, presenting significant challenges due to the condition of the remains. The medical examiner meticulously examined the skeleton for any signs of trauma. There were no gunshot wounds, no evidence of stabbing, no fractures indicative of blunt force trauma. The hyoid bone was intact. The cause of death was initially undetermined. This paradox was baffling. The clandestine burial strongly suggested concealment. Yet, the remains showed no signs of violence. How did Kalen die? And why would someone go to such lengths to hide his body if the death was accidental or natural? Investigators were left with a scenario that made little sense. If Kalen had died accidentally, why didn't Serena seek help? If she was involved in the burial, it seemed physically impossible for her to have dug the grave herself, especially while caring for a 6-month-old baby. Furthermore, where would she have obtained heavy-duty black tarp in the middle of the wilderness? The evidence pointed toward the involvement of a third party, but the lack of trauma on Kaylin's body complicated the narrative of a violent abduction. Faced with the absence of a clear cause of death, the medical examiner ordered specialized toxicological screening. This was a complex and time-consuming process involving the analysis of bone marrow and the decomposition fluids that had been trapped within the tarp. These fluids, a concentrated byproduct of the body's breakdown, might hold chemical clues that had been preserved. Weeks later, the results came back, and they were startling. The analysis detected highly concentrated compounds of rattlesnake venom. The levels were significant, suggesting a severe envenomation shortly before death. The revelation was shocking. Rattlesnakes, while present in Northern California, are exceedingly rare in the deep shade and cool temperatures of the redwood forests. They prefer drier, warmer environments. Investigators consulted with herpetologists, who confirmed that while not impossible, a fatal encounter in this specific ecosystem was extremely rare. The snakebite theory provided a plausible cause of death that aligned with the lack of trauma on the remains. The working theory shifted dramatically. Investigators theorized that Kaylin might have been bitten by a rattlesnake while hiking. Given the potency of the venom and their remote location, the bite could have been fatal within hours. However, this theory still failed to explain the burial or the disappearance of Serena and Isla. If Kaylin died from a snakebite, what happened next? The discovery of the venom partially answered the question of how Kaylin died, but it intensified the mystery surrounding the fate of his wife and child. The investigation shifted gears entirely. The snakebite explained Kaylin's death, but it strongly suggested a third party was involved in the aftermath. Someone else had been there. Someone else had access to the tarp. Someone else had buried Kaylin. The investigation was no longer just about finding missing hikers. It was about reconstructing a complex and terrifying sequence of events that began with a fatal encounter with a snake and ended with a hidden grave. With the realization that a third party was involved in the burial of Kaylin Van Craftoft, the investigation focused on the physical evidence found at the gravesite. The remote location, while initially a hindrance, now became a crucial element of the investigation. Someone had chosen that spot deliberately. Forensic teams analyzed the burial site's documentation. The excavation revealed that the burial was not rushed. The grave was dug carefully, deep enough to avoid easy discovery by animals or casual observation. The body was methodically wrapped in the tarp, suggesting the person involved had time and was not panicked. This indicated that the burial likely occurred shortly after Kaylin's death by someone who felt secure in that location. The most significant piece of evidence was the black tarp itself. It was the one element that didn't belong in the wilderness, the one thing that connected the grave to the outside world. The layers of plastic were meticulously analyzed for trace evidence. In the grave's environment, the tarp had acted as a barrier, preserving not only the decomposition fluids, but also any particles that might have adhered to it before the burial. The forensic analysis of the tarp yielded specific and unusual trace evidence embedded in the plastic fibers and mixed with the soil found on the outer layers. Investigators found microscopic particles of a specific type of volcanic rock dust. This geological signature was significant, as volcanic soil deposits were localized within the vast region and not present at the burial site itself. The volcanic dust suggested the tarp had been stored or used in a location with a different soil composition. In addition to the dust, the analysis detected traces of aged diesel fuel. The presence of diesel suggested the tarp might have been associated with machinery, vehicles, or a storage area where fuel was kept. These two elements, volcanic dust and diesel fuel, provided the first tangible clues about the tarp's origin. Investigators also focused on the material of the tarp itself. It was identified as a specific grade of high durability, UV-resistant plastic, not the typical lightweight material sold in camping stores. This was industrial-grade material used primarily for heavy equipment covering, construction sites, or agricultural use. The investigators began the painstaking process of tracing the manufacturing and distribution of this specific type of tarp. They discovered that this particular batch, identified by its chemical composition and texture, was sold only through a few specialized rural supply outlets in the surrounding counties. The investigation now had three distinct leads: the geographic distribution of the volcanic soil, the locations where diesel fuel might be present, and the outlets that sold the specific tarp. The challenge was to find the intersection of these three elements. A massive mapping project was initiated. Investigators began by mapping the geological surveys of the region, identifying areas characterized by the specific volcanic soil deposits found on the tarp. They then cross-referenced this information with satellite imagery and decades-old property records. They were looking for remote properties, homesteads, or industrial sites located within a drivable radius of the burial site. The presence of diesel suggested they should focus on properties with vehicles or heavy equipment, particularly those accessible via old logging roads or unmaintained tracks. This was not a quick process. The region surrounding the Redwood National and State Parks is sparsely populated, characterized by isolated homesteads, old logging camps, and properties whose owners valued privacy and seclusion. The mapping project generated dozens of potential locations that matched at least some of the criteria. While the forensic and geographical analysis continued, the human element of the tragedy remained central. Odelia Hastings had to process the discovery of Kalen's remains and the bizarre cause of death. The confirmation of his death was devastating, ending 4 years of uncertainty and confirming her worst fears. The explanation of the snakebite provided little comfort. To Odelia, the fact that Kalen had been buried secretly only reinforced her belief that something terrible had happened to Serena and Isla. If Kalen's death was an accident, why hadn't the person who buried him come forward? Why hadn't they helped Serena and Isla? The investigation was now operating under the assumption that Serena and Isla might still be alive, perhaps held captive, or that they had been murdered and disposed of separately. The pressure to identify the origin of the tarp was immense. The painstaking work of the mapping project was narrowing the field, moving the investigation from the vast wilderness to the isolated pockets of human habitation hidden within it. The intersection of the volcanic dust, the diesel fuel, and the agricultural tarp was leading investigators toward a specific area, a place where the secrets of the past 4 years might be hidden. The mapping project, integrating geological data, trace evidence analysis, and supply chain information, began to yield actionable intelligence. The dozens of isolated properties identified were prioritized based on how closely they matched the profile derived from the evidence. Investigators began the systematic process of visiting these locations. Given the sensitive nature of the investigation and the independent, often suspicious nature of the residents in these remote areas, the approach had to be cautious. They couldn't simply arrive and start asking questions about a 4-year-old disappearance and a hidden grave. The investigators often operated under the pretext of routine fire safety compliance checks or illegal cultivation surveys, common reasons for law enforcement presence in the region. This allowed them to assess the residents, observe the premises, and look for the specific elements identified in the investigation without raising suspicion. They visited old logging camps, isolated cabins, and off-grid homesteads. At each location, they looked for rolls of the specific black agricultural tarp, signs of heavy equipment, and the presence of diesel storage. They also took discrete soil samples for comparison with the volcanic dust found at the grave. The investigation eventually focused on a property situated about 8 miles from Kalen's grave. This property was located in an area characterized by the specific volcanic soil identified in the forensic analysis. It was accessible only via a rough, unmaintained track that cut through the dense forest, making it extremely isolated. The property was owned by Juan Yarrow, a man in his late 50s. Local records indicated that Yarrow lived alone and had owned the property for decades. Interviews with locals in the nearest small town painted a picture of Yarrow as an eccentric and sometimes volatile recluse. He was known to live entirely off-grid, rarely coming into town for supplies, and fiercely protective of his privacy. 2 detectives were assigned to conduct the initial visit to Yarrow's homestead. The drive itself was challenging. The unmaintained track required a high-clearance vehicle. As they approached the property, the sense of isolation was profound. The homestead was a collection of structures built over time, a main cabin, several outbuildings, and sheds. The property was cluttered with old machinery, rusting vehicles, and various debris. It had an unkempt, almost feral atmosphere. The detectives approached the main cabin and announced their presence. One Yarrow emerged. He was a weathered man dressed in worn work clothes, his expression immediately defensive and hostile. He questioned the detectives' presence on his property, demanding to know why they were there. The detectives stuck to their pretext of a fire safety compliance check, explaining they were surveying all properties in the area due to the high fire risk. This wasn't an accident. Dr. Brandt's voice was firm, a stark contrast to the phone's crackle. The lead investigator on the new case listened intently as she continued. This is a homicide. That single word sent a jolt through the police department. The dusty, 2-decade-old file on Petra Kroger was reopened with a chilling new urgency. The lead investigator, a sharp, intuitive detective named Thomas Ziegler, immediately immersed himself in the evidence. He pulled up the crime scene photos Leo had taken and placed them next to the official forensic shots. His eyes locked on the boot. Then, he opened the 2002 file, calling up the digital photos sent by the German tourists. He put the images side by side on his monitor. On the left, a smiling Stefan Fiser. His feet were in heavy mountaineering boots with distinctive yellow straps on the crampons. On the right, the single boot found miles away with Petra's remains. Its yellow strap was faded but unmistakable. It was the same make, the same model. But there was more. He checked the sizing information from the forensic report. The boot was a European size 45, a men's boot. It was Stefan's size. It could not have been Petra's. A terrifying new theory began to form. A story far darker than a simple accident. The location of the body, miles from where Stefan claimed the accident happened. The nature of the injuries. And now, a boot that could only belong to Stefan, found right alongside Petra's remains. It suggested a struggle, an attack, and a killer who had lost a piece of his own equipment in the violent aftermath. The mountain hadn't just given up a body, it had preserved a crime scene, and it was pointing directly at one man. The forensic pathologist's report landed on Detective Ziegler's desk like a final verdict. The words homicide, blunt force trauma, and patterned injuries consistent with a weaponized Krampon transformed a 2-decade-old tragedy into an active murder investigation. The file on Petra Kroger, once a dusty relic of a presumed accident, was now the center of a whirlwind of activity. There was no question about the only person of interest, Stefan Fiser. Ziegler, a man who trusted due process, began by building a timeline. He compared the facts of 2002 against the grim reality of 2022. The discrepancies were glaring. The location of the body was the most damning inconsistency. Glaciers move, but not in the way Stefan would need them to. Ziegler consulted a team of glaciologists who confirmed that for Petra's body to end up at the discovery site, she would have had to fall into a crevasse on a completely different part of the mountain range, miles away from where the 2002 search had been focused based on Stefan's own testimony. He had sent the rescuers on a wild goose chase. The question was why. The answer seemed terrifyingly obvious: to ensure Petra was never found. The investigation into Stefan Fiser began discreetly. Ziegler's team needed to know who he was now, not just who he was 20 years ago. They discovered he was a successful architect, a partner in a prestigious firm in Hamburg, hundreds of miles from the Alps. He was well respected, living in a minimalist, modern house with his long-term girlfriend, a landscape designer named Anna. By all appearances, he was a man who had successfully compartmentalized his past, a pillar of his community. Ziegler knew he had to tread carefully. He needed more than a theory and a 20-year-old boot. He needed something to tie the 51-year-old architect to the events of 2002. He needed the other Krampon. It was a long shot. Most people wouldn't keep 2-decade-old mountaineering gear. But climbers were often sentimental about their equipment, especially gear that had been with them on life-changing trips. Working with the Hamburg police, Ziegler's team obtained a search warrant. It was a broad warrant covering Stefan's home, his office, and, crucially, a storage unit registered in his name at his parents' former address in a nearby suburb. The raid was coordinated to happen simultaneously. While detectives arrived at Stefan's sleek, glass-walled office, another team, led by Ziegler, approached the unassuming roll-up door of a suburban storage facility. The search of Stefan's home and office yielded nothing. But in the storage unit, amidst neatly stacked boxes of architectural drawings, old furniture, and forgotten household items, they found it. Tucked away in a back corner was a large, heavy-duty duffel bag caked with a thin layer of dust. Inside was a collection of old mountaineering equipment: ice axes, carabiners, faded climbing rope, and a pair of worn leather boots. Attached to one of those boots was a single yellow-strapped Krampon. It was the mate to the one found on the glacier. The Krampon was carefully bagged and sent express to the Forensic Institute. The team there was looking for something specific, something only visible under a powerful microscope. They examined the 12 steel points one by one. On 3 of the spikes, they found what they were looking for: microscopic stress fractures and infinitesimal flakes of metallic chipping embedded within the surface. A forensic metallurgist was brought in. His conclusion was chilling. The damage was not consistent with the typical scraping and scratching of climbing on rock and ice. This was damage caused by repeated, high-velocity impacts against a surface that had some give but was ultimately hard, a surface like human bone. When compared with the chips found on the matching Krampon from the crime scene, the evidence became a matched set, not just in make and model, but in the very story of violence their metallic structures told. It was time to talk to Stefan Fiser. The confrontation took place in a sterile interview room at a Hamburg police station. Stefan had been brought in under the guise of needing to clarify some details about the new findings in Petra's case. He walked in with the calm, slightly weary air of a man long accustomed to being associated with a tragedy. He sat down opposite Ziegler, his hands folded calmly on the table. Ziegler began gently, recapping the discovery of the remains and expressing his condolences. Stefan nodded, his face a mask of somber acceptance. Then Ziegler slid a large, glossy photograph across the table. It was a close-up of Petra's skull, the patterned puncture wounds clearly visible. Dr. Brandt, our pathologist, found these injuries, Ziegler said, his voice neutral. She says they are not consistent with a fall. Stefan stared at the photo. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Not shock, not grief, but something else. The glacier, the avalanche. It must have happened then, he said, his voice steady. The rocks, the ice. Ziegler let the silence hang in the air before pushing a second photo across the table. It was the boot and Krampon lying on the ice where it was found. We found this near her body, Ziegler said. Our experts have identified it as a man's boot, size 45. Your size, Herr Fiser. Stefan's composure began to crack. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Many people wear those boots. The defense would be formidable. They would argue that the passage of 20 years made any forensic conclusion unreliable. They would hire their own experts, glaciologists to testify about the unpredictable forces of a shifting glacier, metallurgists to claim the damage to the Krampons was inconclusive and could have been caused by normal use. They would paint Stefan Fiser as a victim, a man who had suffered an unimaginable tragedy and was now being re-traumatized by a prosecution team building a fantasy out of ambiguous evidence. Reasonable doubt would be their mantra. To counter this, Ziegler's team had to dig deeper. They needed a motive. Why would a young man seemingly in love with his girlfriend commit such a brutal act on a remote mountaintop? The question sent investigators back in time, re-interviewing the friends and acquaintances of Petra and Stefan from 2002. At first, people were reluctant to speak ill of the past. The couple had been remembered as vibrant, happy, a perfect match. But as investigators gently probed, armed with the new knowledge that this was a homicide investigation, cracks began to appear in that idyllic image. A former colleague of Petra's recalled a conversation in the weeks leading up to the alpine trip. Petra had been uncharacteristically subdued. She had confessed that things with Stefan had become intense. He was talking about marriage and settling down, but she felt suffocated. She had admitted in confidence that she was thinking of ending the relationship. She had hoped the trip to the Alps, a return to the activity that had first brought them together, would either fix things or give her the clarity she needed to leave. Another friend from their climbing club remembered Stefan's temperament. He was charming and charismatic, but he had a possessive streak. He described an incident months before the trip where Stefan had gotten into a heated public argument with a man who was harmlessly flirting with Petra at a party. The friend described Stefan's anger as going from 0 to 100, a sudden, shocking flash of rage that was as quickly suppressed as it appeared. A motive began to solidify, one as old as time, jealousy and control. The prosecution theorized that the final confrontation had happened on that glacial plateau. Perhaps Petra had chosen that moment in the stark beauty of the Alps to tell Stefan it was over. An argument erupted in the thin air, with emotions running high. His temper had flared. The ensuing violence, they argued, was not premeditated but a spontaneous explosion of rage. He had used what was at hand, or rather, on his feet. He had attacked her, and in the struggle, his own boot had come off. He then concocted the story of the crevasse, a plausible lie in an environment where accidents were common. He had directed the search party to the wrong location, confident the mountain would keep his secret forever. His frostbite, his harrowing tale of survival, it was all real, but it was the result of his own desperate, panicked escape after committing murder, not an accident. The circumstantial case was strong, a web of interconnected evidence. The location, the injuries, the weapon, the motive, it all pointed to Stefan. But the lack of a confession or a direct witness meant the reasonable doubt argument loomed large. The prosecutors and Ziegler's team debated their next steps. They could arrest him now and risk a difficult trial. Or they could continue to build their case, hoping to find one more piece of evidence, one more witness from the past that would make his conviction a certainty. They decided to wait, to tighten the net, believing time was on their side. They placed Stefan under discretion.